The only truth that conscious people see and that the world is not ready to hear. There is a specific quality of awareness that develops in some people, not through any particular intelligence or education or special gift, but through the simple, difficult practice of paying honest attention to what is actually happening. That produces a form of seeing that the world around them is not yet prepared to receive. It is not the seeing of prophets or mystics, though it has been described in those terms across many cultures and many centuries. It is something more ordinary and more uncomfortable than that. It is the seeing of a person who has stopped allowing the frameworks they were given to do the work of perception for them, who has insisted on looking at what is actually there rather than at what the available stories say should be there, and who has discovered, in that looking, a set of truths so fundamental and so consistently avoided that speaking them clearly requires a specific kind of courage that has little to do with bravery in any conventional sense. Yuval Noah Harari has spent decades in precisely this kind of honest looking, and the specific truths he has identified as most important and most consistently avoided by the mainstream frameworks of contemporary life are not comfortable ones. They do not offer reassurance. They do not confirm the narratives that most people find most sustaining. They do not promise that things will work out if we simply continue in the directions we are already moving, with perhaps minor adjustments at the margins. They do the opposite. They reveal, with a precision that is difficult to dismiss as pessimism or alarmism, the degree to which the most important realities of the current moment are being systematically avoided, not because people are stupid or malicious, but because the available frameworks for understanding the world are not adequate to what is actually happening, and the gap between framework and reality is too uncomfortable to inhabit without either closing your eyes or changing the framework. The first truth that conscious people see, the one that Harari returns to most consistently, and that the world is perhaps least ready to hear in its full implications, is that the human beings living today are not the final form of intelligent life on this planet. They are not the culmination of evolutionary history, but a transition point within it, and the transition that is currently underway is not the gradual generational transformation that previous evolutionary and cultural transitions have involved, but something qualitatively different in its speed and in the degree to which it is being consciously designed rather than blindly evolved. The beings that will exist on this planet 50 years from now, in the most probable scenarios that honest analysis of current technological trajectories produces, will differ from current human beings not merely in the way that people today differ from people of a century ago, in their tools, their cultural frameworks, their knowledge and capabilities, but in their fundamental biological and cognitive constitution, in what their brains can do, in how long they live, in the degree to which their capacities are biological versus artificial, in what they experience as the limits of the possible. This is the truth that the world is not ready to hear because it requires sitting with implications that most available frameworks are specifically designed to avoid. The religious frameworks that have organized human life for millennia are built on the premise of a stable human nature, a creature made in a specific image whose fundamental constitution is given rather than designed. The humanist frameworks that replaced religious ones in the most secularized societies are built on the premise of human beings as the ultimate values and the ultimate measure of significance, a framework that does not cope well with the prospect of beings that are improvements on human beings in most of the ways that humanist values care about. The political frameworks that organize collective life around the rights and interests of human beings as currently constituted have not begun to grapple with what rights and interests mean for beings that are significantly different from current humans, or for the human beings who did not undergo enhancement and who therefore exist alongside enhanced beings in a world whose social and economic structures were designed for the enhanced. The second truth that conscious people see is more immediately practical and more immediately unsettling in its daily implications. It is the truth that the systems within which most people organize their lives and make their choices are not, despite their surface appearance of rationality and legitimacy, oriented toward the genuine flourishing of the people who inhabit them. They are oriented toward their own reproduction, their own expansion, their own perpetuation across time. The economic systems are oriented toward the generation and concentration of capital. The political systems are oriented toward the maintenance and expansion of power. The information systems are oriented toward the capture and retention of attention. The social systems are oriented toward the enforcement of the norms that make social coordination possible, which is not the same thing as the norms that make individual flourishing most available. In each case, the system has an inner logic, a direction of movement that it follows by its own structural imperatives, and the genuine well-being of the human beings who populate it is a relevant consideration only insofar as it serves or can be made to serve the system's own directional imperatives. Most people spend their entire lives inside these systems without clearly seeing them as systems, as structures with their own interests and their own logics that are not identical with the interests and logics of the people they contain. They experience the demands of the system as the demands of reality itself, as the natural order of things, rather than as the specific configuration of one possible arrangement of human social life among many. They experience the values the system promotes as their own values, organically generated by their own authentic preferences, rather than as values that were systematically instilled by processes of socialization that the system itself produces and that serve the system's interests more reliably than they serve the interests of the people being socialized. The conscious person who sees this does not thereby escape the system. No one escapes the system in any complete sense, but they are in a different relationship with it. A relationship that includes the capacity to recognize the system's demands as the system's demands rather than as the inescapable demands of reality, and that therefore includes, however limited, genuine freedom to choose which of the system's demands to serve and which to resist. The third truth is one that Harari has articulated with specific clarity and that remains, despite everything that has been written about it, genuinely difficult for most people to receive in its full implications. It is the truth about the stories. The truth that the things human beings fight for most passionately, die for most willingly, organize their collective lives around most completely, the nations, the ideologies, the religious identities, the economic systems, the cultural frameworks that feel like the most solid and most undeniable features of human reality are constructions. They are shared stories that have achieved the status of reality through the accumulated weight of collective belief. They are not false in the sense of being merely invented. They are real in the specific sense that their consequences are real, that they shape the physical world through the human behavior they organize, but they are not real in the sense of existing independently of the human minds that believe in them. The nation does not exist in the forest or the mountain. It exists in the agreement of the people who recognize it. The corporation does not exist in any physical sense. It exists as a legal fiction, a shared story enforced by institutions that are themselves shared stories. The value of money is entirely a function of the shared agreement to treat certain tokens as representing value. Remove the agreement and the money is paper. This truth is not merely philosophical. It has profound and immediate practical implications that the world is not ready to hear if the most important structures organizing human collective life are shared stories rather than natural facts, then those structures are in principle revisable. Not easily, not without enormous cost and conflict, and the specific difficulties that always accompany the transition from one shared story to another, but revisable. The specific configuration of the global economy is not written into the laws of physics. It is written into the agreements, both explicit and implicit, that human beings maintain with each other about how resources are allocated and value is measured. The specific configuration of the international political order is not a natural fact about the world. It is a set of shared stories about which entities have the right to exercise force in which territories and under what conditions. The specific hierarchy of values that organizes what gets funded and what gets ignored, what gets protected and what gets destroyed, is not an objective ranking of things according to their actual importance. It is a culturally produced consensus about importance that reflects the interests of the entities with the most power to shape cultural consensus. Conscious people see this. They see the construction behind the apparent natural order, and the seeing is both liberating and profoundly lonely, because the people around them who have not yet made this specific perceptual shift experience the constructions as simply the way things are, and they experience the conscious person's insistence on seeing them as constructions, as a kind of threatening instability rather than as a form of honesty about the nature of the shared environment. The fourth truth is perhaps the most immediately personal, and it is the one that generates the most resistance because it targets not the external social world, but the inner structure of the self. It is the truth that the self, the entity that each person experiences as the continuous, unified, authentic subject of their experience, the thing that thinks and feels and chooses and persists across time as the same something, is itself a construction. Not in the sense of being fake or unimportant, but in the sense of being a story the brain tells about itself, a narrative constructed from the raw material of moment-to-moment experience and organized into the appearance of a stable, continuous, unified entity that persists through time and across contexts. Neuroscience and contemplative philosophy converge on this insight from different directions with remarkable consistency. The brain does not contain a homunculus, a little person inside who is doing the experiencing and making the choices. It contains billions of neurons operating in complex, dynamic patterns that produce behavior and experience without any single unified controller who corresponds to the sense of self that the experiencer feels from the inside. The self is not the controller of these processes. It is their product, a useful fiction generated by the processing rather than the agent of the processing. And the intuition of freedom, the sense of being a unified agent who could have done otherwise than they did, is itself part of the fiction, a narrative construction that does not correspond to any mechanism in the actual causal story of how behavior is produced. This is the truth that the world is least ready to hear because it threatens something that feels more fundamental than any political or economic arrangement. It threatens the intuition of personal agency, the sense of being a real, continuous, free self whose choices matter and whose existence has intrinsic significance. And yet the truth, when it is genuinely received rather than merely intellectually noted, does not produce what people fear it will produce. It does not produce nihilism or fatalism or the collapse of motivation. It produces something more interesting and more freeing. It produces a lighter relationship with the self and its narratives, a capacity to hold the self's stories with appropriate distance, to notice the construction without being entirely captured by it, to make choices without being entirely enslaved to the fiction of absolute freedom that the uncritical belief in the unified self produces. The person who knows that the self is a construction is not thereby less themselves. They are more free in their relationship to being themselves. The fifth truth that conscious people see, and that the world is genuinely not ready to hear in its full implications, concerns the specific moment in history that we are living through and what that moment actually requires of the people living in it. The world is not organized to produce the specific kinds of choices and the specific kinds of collective action that the current moment most needs. The economic systems reward short-term optimization over long-term wisdom. The political systems reward the management of present constituencies over the stewardship of future consequences. The information systems reward emotional intensity over epistemic accuracy. The educational systems reward the acquisition of credentials over the development of genuine understanding. The cultural systems reward visibility and performance over the quiet, sustained, genuinely difficult work of actually thinking clearly about what matters most. The specific form of intelligence, the specific quality of attention, the specific kind of courage that the current moment most needs are not the kinds that the world's current systems are best designed to produce and reward. The world needs, more than it has ever needed, people who can hold complexity without premature resolution, who can maintain genuine uncertainty without collapsing into either false certainty or paralytic despair, who can see the constructions clearly without losing the ability to act within them wisely, who can hold the long view without abandoning the immediate, who can be moved by the weight of what is at stake without being destroyed by it. These are qualities that the available frameworks of education, recognition, and reward do not systematically develop or adequately value. They are qualities that develop through specific practices, specific forms of honesty, and specific relationships that most of the prevailing systems actively work against. And the people who have developed them, who can see what conscious people see, often find themselves in the specific isolation that this document began by describing, present in the rooms of their lives, but not quite at home in them, belonging to the world without quite fitting any of its available frameworks, carrying a form of seeing that the world around them has not yet found adequate ways to receive. The world is not ready to hear these truths, not because the world is stupid or evil. The world is not ready to hear them because the specific combination of cognitive comfort, institutional momentum, economic incentive, and cultural inertia that organizes the prevailing consensus of any era is always, by its nature, most adequate to the previous era rather than to the current one. The truths that conscious people see are, almost by definition, the truths that the current frameworks are not yet adequate to. They are the leading edge of a reckoning with reality that the prevailing consensus has not yet made, and that every effort of the prevailing consensus is directed toward deferring for as long as possible. And yet the truths cannot be indefinitely deferred. Reality does not accommodate the indefinite avoidance of its most important features. The gap between the prevailing story and the actual situation eventually becomes too large to maintain without the kind of reality collision that forces, in different ways and with different costs, depending on how long the avoidance has been sustained, a reconfiguration of the frameworks through which the world is understood and organized. The only question that matters in the face of this historical pattern that has repeated itself across the full arc of human civilization is whether the reckoning will happen early enough, with enough genuinely informed understanding of what is being reckoned with, to be navigated wisely, or late enough and with enough accumulated denial that the collision, when it comes, is more destructive than it needed to be. The conscious people who see these truths are not seers or prophets in any supernatural sense. They are people who have simply refused to stop looking when looking becomes uncomfortable, who have maintained the habit of honest attention in the face of all the very powerful incentives toward the comfortable avoidance that the prevailing frameworks make so readily available. And the specific contribution that they're seeing makes possible, the specific value of being a person who can see what most people around them cannot yet see, is not primarily the satisfaction of being right, though that is real enough. It is the possibility of contributing, however modestly, to the specific process by which the truths that the world is not yet ready to hear become truths that the world is beginning to hear. Of participating in the gradual, difficult, enormously important work of closing the gap between the prevailing story and the actual situation before that gap becomes wide enough to produce a collision that could have been avoided. The only truth that conscious people see is not one truth, but many, woven together by the common thread of honest attention to what is actually happening rather than to what the available frameworks say should be happening. And the world's unreadiness to hear it is not permanent. It is the specific unreadiness of a specific moment, a moment that is passing, in which the frameworks inherited from previous eras are proving increasingly inadequate to the realities of the current one. and in which the truths that conscious people see are gradually, painfully, necessarily becoming the truths that everyone will eventually need to reckon with. The question is only whether the reckoning comes early enough to be genuinely wise, or late enough to be unnecessarily catastrophic. And the answer to that question depends, more than most people are yet prepared to acknowledge, on how many people are willing to do the specific, uncomfortable, countercultural work of actually seeing what is there rather than what the comfortable stories say should be there, on how many people are willing to become, in this specific sense, conscious, and on what those people choose to do with the seeing once they can no longer avoid it. The world is not ready to hear these truths, but the world rarely is until it has to be. And the people who see them before the world is ready are not ahead of their time in any comfortable sense. They are simply doing the work of honest attention that every era requires of someone, and that every era tends to reward, if it rewards at all, primarily in retrospect. That has always been the specific burden and the specific dignity of the conscious person. And in this era, the era of the most consequential transition in the history of the species, it is also the most important work available. See clearly, speak honestly, and trust that the truth, however unready the world is to hear it, finds its way through eventually in the hands of the people who refused to stop saying it. There is a sixth truth that deserves its own careful attention, one that Harari's work gestures toward repeatedly, without always naming directly. And that may be among the most practically important of the truths that conscious people see. It is the truth about suffering and its relationship to awareness. The common assumption, embedded in almost every framework that promises human improvement, is that greater awareness leads to greater well-being, that understanding more produces feeling better, that the enlightened person is the contented person. But the actual experience of people who develop genuine awareness, who do the specific work of honest attention to what is actually happening in the world and in themselves, frequently contradicts this assumption in ways that the frameworks promoting awareness are reluctant to acknowledge. Seeing clearly often hurts more than not seeing. The person who genuinely understands the scale of ecological destruction already underway carries a weight that the person who has not fully registered it does not carry. The person who genuinely understands the specific mechanisms by which the digital information environment is shaping the beliefs and desires and political perceptions of billions of people experiences a specific form of distress in their daily navigation of that environment that the person who has not seen these mechanisms does not experience. The person who genuinely understands the degree to which the frameworks organizing collective life are constructions that serve certain interests more than others, rather than natural facts about the world, leaves with a persistent quality of friction in their engagement with those frameworks that the person who experiences them as simply the way things are does not experience. This suffering is not the suffering of ignorance, the suffering of a person whose circumstances are bad, and who lacks the knowledge that would allow them to improve them. It is the suffering of awareness, the suffering of a person whose circumstances are in many respects adequate, but whose perception of what those circumstances actually are and what they mean is more complete than the surrounding culture's frameworks are designed to support. And this form of suffering is, in a sense that the world is genuinely not ready to hear, a form of health. It is the appropriate response of a genuinely attentive organism to an actually troubling situation. The absence of it in the face of the actual situation is not peace, it is avoidance. And avoidance, however comfortable, is a form of dysfunction in a being whose survival depends on accurate perception of the environment. The conscious person who sees clearly and suffers appropriately in response to what they see is not performing suffering or indulging in unnecessary anxiety. They are responding with the specific form of appropriate distress that honest engagement with the current situation actually warrants, and that the surrounding culture's frameworks are specifically designed to prevent, because the distress of conscious people, if it were widely shared, would generate the kind of collective urgency that would require the prevailing systems to change in ways that those systems are organized to avoid. This is why the truths that conscious people see are not only the truths the world is not ready to hear. They are, in a specific and important sense, the truths that the world's systems are actively organized to prevent from being heard, not through overt censorship in most cases, but through the more effective mechanisms of distraction, of the provision of alternative narratives more comfortable than these, of the social marginalization of those who insist on saying them clearly, and of the specific emotional management that the digital information environment performs so effectively in keeping the attention of billions of people oriented toward the stimulating and the immediately manageable and away from the difficult and the large and the genuinely important. The person who has seen these truths and who chooses to remain with them, who refuses the available routes of comfortable avoidance, is not performing heroism. They are simply doing the work of honest attention in the face of everything that the surrounding environment deploys to prevent it. And the specific quality of that work, the combination of clear seeing and continued engagement, of appropriate suffering and continued action, of genuine uncertainty and continued commitment, is perhaps the most important quality that the current moment can produce in the human beings who are living through it. Harari's work is ultimately, beneath all its historical scope and philosophical depth and biological precision, an invitation to this quality. Not an invitation to despair, not an invitation to certainty, not an invitation to any particular ideological commitment or political program, but an invitation to see, to actually look at what is there, to maintain honest attention in the face of the enormous and sophisticated and largely invisible apparatus of comfortable avoidance that the current information environment represents. To discover, in the looking, the specific truths that conscious people see, and to choose with full awareness of the cost to continue seeing them rather than allowing the available routes of avoidance to close the seeing back down. The world is not ready to hear these truths. It has never been ready for the most important truths of any era before it had to be. What makes the current moment different is the specific urgency of the transition being navigated and the specific narrowness of the window within which the truths being seen most clearly by the most conscious people need to become the truths being engaged with most broadly by the largest possible proportion of the population. Not because universally shared truth is achievable, it is not, but because the specific decisions being made in this specific period will be shaped by the specific distribution of awareness in the population that has to make them. More awareness, more broadly distributed, produces better decisions. Better decisions, made in this specific window, produce better outcomes across the entire subsequent arc. The only truth that conscious people see is that the world is not what the available stories say it is. That the most important realities are the ones the available stories are least equipped to address. That the moment being lived through is genuinely unlike what came before in the ways that matter most. And that what is required of the people who see this is not the comfort of being right, but the effort of continuing to say it clearly enough, in enough contexts, with enough honesty and enough humility about the limits of their own seeing, that the world, which is never ready to hear the most important truths, becomes slightly more ready than it was. That is the only work. It is enough. And it begins with the specific, demanding, irreplaceable act of actually seeing what is there rather than what is comfortable to see. The world is not ready. But the world is never ready until the people who see clearly enough choose to speak and to keep speaking until the world finally hears.